when Stalin asked Oppenheimer to build a bomb for peace, nuclear bomb. The mushroom cloud that blossomed over Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, was not merely the end of a war. It was the violent birth of a new age, an era defined by the chilling specter of ultimate destruction. In an instant, the world's understanding of warfare, power, and human vulnerability was fundamentally reshaped. The flash and subsequent inferno that consumed a city introduced humanity to the atomic bomb, a weapon so devastating it promised not just victory, but annihilation. This terrifying revelation sent ripples of fear and awe across the globe, forever altering the geopolitical landscape and igniting an unprecedented arms race that would define the latter half of the 20th century. At the heart of this epochal shift stood J. Robert Oppenheimer, the brilliant, enigmatic theoretical physicist often hailed as the father of the atomic bomb. A man of profound intellect and complex moral convictions, Oppenheimer had marshaled the scientific genius of the Manhattan Project, transforming abstract theories into a tangible, horrifying reality. Yet, the triumph of scientific achievement was quickly overshadowed by a gnawing sense of responsibility and dread. He famously recalled a line from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." This profound realization would haunt him, shaping his post-war advocacy for international control of nuclear energy and his increasingly vocal warnings against the perils of an unchecked arms race. He saw the bomb not as a mere weapon, but as a harbinger of potential global cataclysm, a force that demanded a new paradigm of international cooperation and ethical consideration. Thousands of miles away, behind the Iron Curtain that was already beginning to descend across Eastern Europe, Joseph Stalin, the ruthless and paranoid dictator of the Soviet Union, watched with a mixture of alarm and grim determination. He understood the atomic bomb's power not just as a military instrument, but as the ultimate political leverage. The American monopoly on this devastating technology was an unbearable affront to Soviet prestige and a direct threat to his vision of expanding communist influence. For Stalin, the bomb was the ultimate symbol of power, and he would stop at nothing to acquire it for the Soviet Union. His directives to his own scientists, led by the brilliant but less publicly known Igor Kurchatov, were clear and uncompromising: replicate the American bomb, and do so with extreme urgency, regardless of cost or consequence. The Cold War, though not yet formally declared, had already begun its chilling descent, fueled by ideological conflict, mutual suspicion, and the terrifying new currency of atomic power. The immediate post-war years saw the rapid deterioration of the wartime alliance between the Western powers and the Soviet Union. The ideological chasm widened, giving rise to proxy conflicts, espionage, and a relentless technological race. The Berlin blockade, the Korean War, and the constant saber-rattling across divided Europe all served to underscore the fragility of peace and the ever-present threat of a global conflagration. Oppenheimer, now a prominent public figure and advisor to the U.S. government, found himself caught in a vortex of scientific advancement and moral quandary. He argued passionately for a future where nuclear technology would be placed under international supervision, believing that only through such radical cooperation could humanity hope to survive the very power it had unleashed. He opposed the development of the even more destructive hydrogen bomb, viewing it as an unnecessary and dangerous escalation that would only accelerate the arms race towards an inevitable, catastrophic conclusion. His dissent, however, was often met with suspicion and ultimately led to his tragic downfall, stripped of his security clearance amidst accusations of disloyalty. Yet, even as Oppenheimer's influence waned within his own government, his reputation as the singular mind behind the atomic age remained undimmed. His public pronouncements, his intellectual gravitas, and his very public struggles with the moral implications of his creation made him a figure of peculiar fascination, even to the Soviet regime. Stalin, despite his deep distrust of anything and anyone associated with the West, possessed a cold, calculating intellect that recognized genius wherever it appeared. He was a master of psychological warfare, and understood the symbolic power of individuals. While his own scientists, under immense pressure, were making rapid strides in developing the Soviet atomic bomb, the idea of Oppenheimer, the very architect of the enemy's ultimate weapon, somehow contributing to Soviet power, even if indirectly or conceptually, would have held a perverse, irresistible allure for the Soviet leader. The bomb for peace concept, as paradoxical as it sounded, was not entirely alien to the rhetoric of the nascent nuclear age. Both sides, in their public pronouncements, often framed their nuclear arsenals as deterrents, as weapons designed to prevent war through the sheer terror of retaliation. For Stalin, a bomb for peace would be the ultimate cynical gambit, a tool to enforce a Soviet-dominated global order under the guise of humanitarian concern, a way to neutralize Western advantage, while projecting an image of benevolence that was utterly false. It would be a psychological weapon aimed squarely at the moral conscience of the West, and perhaps, more subtly, at Oppenheimer himself. The question, then, becomes not if Stalin would consider such an audacious and improbable move, but how such an unthinkable proposition could ever be delivered. It would certainly not be through official diplomatic channels, nor a direct, open invitation. Such a request would be shrouded in the deepest secrecy, a clandestine overture carefully crafted to appeal to Oppenheimer's known moral compass and his deep-seated desire to prevent nuclear annihilation. Imagine a world teetering even closer to the brink than it historically did, a moment of such acute global crisis that conventional diplomacy had utterly failed, and desperate, unconventional measures were being contemplated by all sides. Perhaps a third party, an intermediary with impeccable credentials, and a shared vision of averting catastrophe, would be subtly leveraged. Or perhaps, a highly sophisticated intelligence operation, meticulously designed to exploit Oppenheimer's growing disillusionment with American nuclear policy and his fervent belief in international control. The message, stripped of its true geopolitical intent, would be framed as a plea for universal survival, a desperate call to the one man who truly understood the destructive power he had unleashed to help create a new kind of deterrent. The proposition, when it finally coalesced through layers of deception and carefully curated rhetoric, would present itself not as an act of betrayal against his own nation, but as a potentially singular opportunity to genuinely avert global catastrophe. The bomb, this new peace bomb, would be presented as a mechanism to enforce global disarmament, a weapon held by a neutral international body, or so it would be framed, ensuring no single nation could ever again wield such power for aggression. For Oppenheimer, a man tormented by the blood on his hands and desperate for a way to mitigate the existential threat he had helped create, such a proposition, however repugnant its source, would ignite an immense internal struggle. The immediate shock, the ethical abyss of collaborating with an ideological adversary, the profound betrayal of his own nation's trust, these would clash violently with the slim, agonizing possibility that this unimaginable offer, however twisted, might just be the only path left to avert the ultimate war. The very idea would force him to confront the deepest recesses of his own moral code and the terrifying implications of his legacy. He who had given the world the means of its destruction was now being asked, by its foremost adversary, to build a new kind of bomb, one purportedly for peace, a weapon to end all wars by making war unthinkable. The irony, the danger, and the sheer audacity of the request would be almost unbearable. The world held its breath, unknowingly, as this unthinkable proposition began to take shape in the shadows, threatening to redefine the very meaning of nuclear power and the fragile concept of peace in an atomic age. The chill of the autumn evening bit into J. Robert Oppenheimer as he walked the quiet paths of Princeton, his mind a perpetual maelstrom of equations, moral dilemmas, and the echoing silence of official disfavor. Stripped of his security clearance, his influence curtailed, he was a prophet without honor in his own land. His warnings about the hydrogen bomb and the escalating arms race dismissed as disloyalty. His past associations scrutinized with venomous suspicion. The irony was a bitter taste. The man who had brought the atomic age into being was now deemed too dangerous to guide its future. He found solace, or at least distraction, in his academic pursuits, but the specter of global annihilation, his own creation, clung to him like a shroud. He yearned for a way to undo what had been done, to cage the genie he had released, but felt increasingly powerless, marginalized. It was during this period of profound isolation and intellectual exile that the unthinkable overture began to take shape. Not through official channels, nor a brazen direct approach, but through a series of subtle, almost imperceptible nudges, each one designed with a masterful understanding of Oppenheimer's unique psychological landscape. The initial contact was an old acquaintance, a European physicist Oppenheimer had known from pre-war days, a man of impeccable academic credentials and a well-documented, albeit naive, belief in universal scientific brotherhood. The meeting was ostensibly social, a reunion over coffee in a dimly lit Parisian café, far from the prying eyes of Washington or Moscow. The conversation drifted, as it always did with Oppenheimer, to the existential threat of nuclear weapons, the folly of the arms race, and the desperate need for a new paradigm of international cooperation. The old friend, a Dr. Armand Du Bois, spoke with a weariness that mirrored Oppenheimer's own, his voice hushed, eyes scanning the room as if expecting unseen listeners. Du Bois spoke of a growing movement among certain influential figures, not aligned with any specific government, who believed that the current trajectory was unsustainable, leading only to mutual destruction. He spoke of a radical, audacious plan, so desperate it bordered on madness, yet offered perhaps the only glimmer of hope. This plan, Du Bois confided, involved a universal deterrent, a single, internationally controlled weapon, so potent that its mere existence would render all other warfare obsolete, forcing global disarmament through absolute terror. A bomb for peace, he called it, echoing the very paradox that Oppenheimer himself had often contemplated in his darkest hours. Oppenheimer listened, his pipe clutched forgotten in his hand, a cold dread creeping through him, mingled with a strange, almost illicit curiosity. He knew Du Bois was a man of peace, genuinely horrified by the nuclear threat, but he also knew the world was not so simple, not so pure. The concept of a peace bomb was seductive, a siren song to his deepest desires, his yearning for atonement. But the source, the true architects of this audacious proposal, remained unspoken, a heavy, unspoken presence in the air. Du Bois, with carefully chosen words, hinted at powerful forces from across the divide, who, despite their ideological differences, shared this singular, desperate vision of preventing global catastrophe. He painted a picture of a world on the precipice, where only the most extreme measures, even collaboration with former adversaries, could pull humanity back from the brink. The proposition, when it finally emerged from Du Bois's careful circumlocutions, was breathtaking in its audacity, a request, not for betrayal, but for salvation. Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, was being asked to lend his unparalleled genius, his unique understanding of the weapon's very essence, to design a new kind of deterrent. This peace bomb would not be a weapon of aggression, so Du Bois insisted, but a sacred trust, held by a proposed international consortium, its sole purpose to ensure no nation, including the Soviet Union or the United States, could ever again threaten the world with nuclear war. The implicit message, unspoken but clear, was that Stalin, through his emissaries, was offering Oppenheimer a chance to fulfill his deepest moral convictions, to truly become the destroyer of worlds. In reverse, a builder of peace, even if that peace was enforced by ultimate terror. The shock that coursed through Oppenheimer was profound, a physical jolt. His mind, accustomed to dissecting complex scientific problems, now grappled with an ethical equation of unimaginable complexity. Collaborate with the Soviets? The very notion was anathema, a betrayal of everything he had ever stood for, a treasonous act that would shatter his already fragile reputation and likely lead to his utter ruin. His country had already branded him a risk, marginalized him. This would be the final, damning proof of their suspicions. The immediate, visceral reaction was rejection, a furious dismissal of such a monstrous idea. How could he, an American citizen, even consider such a thing? Yet, beneath the patriotic outrage, a dangerous seed of thought began to germinate. The American government had rejected his pleas for international control, had pushed relentlessly for the hydrogen bomb, escalating the arms race towards what he believed was an inevitable catastrophe. His own warnings had gone unheeded. He had seen the nascent, fragile attempts at international cooperation crumble under the weight of ideological suspicion and nationalistic ambition. Was this, then, a twisted, perverse opportunity to achieve what he had failed to do within the confines of American policy? To take the reins of the very monster he had created and steer it towards true peace, however brutal the means? The internal conflict was a raging inferno. Oppenheimer pictured the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima, the lines from the Bhagavad Gita echoing in his ears. He had witnessed the birth of the atomic age, and he carried its weight on his conscience. He envisioned a future where cities vaporized, civilizations crumbled, all because humanity lacked the wisdom to control the power it had unleashed. The bomb for peace was a horrifying concept, a weapon designed to enforce global submission, but if it truly meant an end to all wars, an end to the proliferation that terrified him, could he, in good conscience, simply dismiss it? He interrogated Du Bois with an intensity that bordered on accusation, his mind racing through every conceivable angle, every potential trap. "Who exactly are these influential figures?" Oppenheimer demanded, his voice low and strained. "And how do they propose such a weapon would be controlled? Who would hold the keys to this ultimate power? And what guarantee is there that it would not simply become another instrument of Soviet domination, another means to enforce their peace at the barrel of a gun, or rather, the flash of an atomic bomb?" Du Bois, though visibly uncomfortable under Oppenheimer's piercing gaze, maintained a facade of earnest conviction. He spoke of a truly neutral body, composed of scientists and diplomats from unaligned nations, given an unprecedented mandate. He spoke of a moral imperative so profound that it transcended national allegiances. He spoke, most importantly, of Stalin's personal commitment, a commitment born, not of idealism, but of a cold, pragmatic recognition that even the Soviet Union could not survive a full-scale nuclear exchange. "Comrade Stalin," Du Bois relayed, using the honorific with a slight, almost imperceptible hesitation, "sees this not as a path to conquest, but as a path to stability. A stability where the West's technological advantage is neutralized, and the risk of mutual annihilation is eliminated. He understands, perhaps more acutely than anyone, the absolute power of this weapon, and therefore its potential to enforce a lasting, if terrifying, peace." Oppenheimer scoffed internally at the idea of Stalin's commitment to anything but his own power, yet the sheer audacity of the gambit held him captive. He knew Stalin was a ruthless pragmatist, a man who would exploit any weakness, any idealism, for his own ends. Was this a subtle, Machiavellian ploy to lure him, the symbolic father of the enemy's ultimate weapon, into a web of deceit, to gain intelligence, or perhaps even to discredit him further in the West? Or was it, just possibly, a desperate measure from a man who, despite his monstrous nature, understood the terrifying reality of the new age better than many in the West? The thought of working with Soviet scientists, of sharing his knowledge with the very regime that sought to undermine American democracy, was repulsive. He had dedicated his life to science, yes, but also to his country. He had helped defeat fascism, and now he was being asked to potentially aid communism. The moral tightrope he was being asked to walk was impossibly thin, stretched over an abyss of global consequence. His reputation, already in tatters, would be utterly destroyed. His legacy would be forever tainted, not just by the bomb, but by an act of perceived betrayal. Yet, the alternative was equally grim: to stand by, powerless, as the two superpowers hurtled towards an inevitable conflict, each building bigger, more destructive weapons, each convinced of its own righteousness, each blind to the shared precipice. Oppenheimer had seen the intelligence reports, understood the rapid pace of Soviet nuclear development. He knew that their bomb was coming, regardless of his actions. Perhaps his involvement, however tainted, could guide this peace bomb project away from pure destructive power and towards a truly deterrent, internationally controlled force, if such a thing were even possible. He imagined the world freed from the constant dread of nuclear war, a world where the very act of aggression was met with an unthinkable, universal response. It was a utopian vision, one that ran contrary to every lesson of history, yet it pulsed with a desperate appeal to his deep-seated desire for peace. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, suffocating him. He was a scientist, a man of logic, yet this choice transcended mere logic. It was a moral crucible, demanding a sacrifice of personal honor, national loyalty, and perhaps even his own soul, for the slim, terrifying chance of saving humanity from itself. The conflicts raged within him: the duty to his nation versus the duty to mankind, the abhorrence of Stalin's regime versus the desperate hope for peace, the fear of manipulation versus the yearning for redemption. The proposition was a poisoned chalice, yet it promised a cure, however bitter. He knew he could not simply dismiss it out of hand. The very act of considering it, however briefly, had already implicated him in the shadow play. He had to engage, if only to understand the full scope of the deception or the opportunity. "Dr. Du Bois," Oppenheimer finally said, his voice raspy, "this is a matter of unprecedented gravity. It requires more than a cafe conversation. It requires details, guarantees, and a profound understanding of the implications. If such a proposal were ever to be considered, it would have to be with the utmost transparency regarding its true intent and control. And I would need to know, unequivocally, that this peace bomb would truly serve humanity, and not merely become a more potent tool in the hands of one power over another." His words were a reluctant concession, a crack in his staunch refusal, opening the door, ever so slightly, to the abyss. The game had begun, and Oppenheimer, the reluctant pawn, found himself drawn into a terrifying dance with the devil, a dance for the future of the world. He knew that whatever path he chose, his life, and perhaps the world, would never be the same. The shadow of the mushroom cloud now had a new, more complex, and infinitely more dangerous twin, the shadow of a peace bomb, wielded by the unseen hand of Joseph Stalin. Robert Oppenheimer agreed to a series of subsequent, intensely discreet meetings with Dr. Du Bois, each one held in a different European city, under the guise of academic conferences or private consultations. These encounters were orchestrated with meticulous precision, reflecting the shadowy expertise of Soviet intelligence. Oppenheimer, ever the physicist, approached the clandestine discussions like a complex problem, dissecting Du Bois's carefully worded proposals, probing for inconsistencies, and searching for the underlying truths. He demanded blueprints, control schematics, and detailed organizational charts for this proposed international body. Du Bois, seemingly earnest, provided what he could, always emphasizing the universal desire for peace and the urgent need to transcend national rivalries. He spoke of a Council of Guardians, composed of scientists and diplomats from neutral nations, empowered to activate the peace bomb only in response to an act of explicit nuclear aggression or a clear threat of global war. Yet, with each detail revealed, a chilling pattern began to emerge for Oppenheimer. The proposed locations for the peace bombs, components and assembly plants, though ostensibly neutral territories, invariably leaned towards Eastern Bloc nations or countries with strong Soviet sympathies. The technical specifications, while brilliant in their theoretical scope, subtly mirrored Soviet design philosophies and material requirements, suggesting a profound influence from Moscow's own nascent atomic program. The neutral scientists Du Bois mentioned were often figures Oppenheimer recognized as having strong, albeit sometimes covert, ties to communist ideologies or Soviet-funded research. Even Du Bois himself, under Oppenheimer's relentless intellectual scrutiny, occasionally let slip a phrase or a technical detail that betrayed a deeper, more direct connection to Soviet scientific circles than a mere universal scientific brotherhood would imply. The more Oppenheimer dug, the clearer the picture became. This was not a truly neutral international endeavor. This was a sophisticated, Machiavellian gambit by Joseph Stalin, designed to achieve multiple objectives simultaneously. Firstly, it was a profound psychological operation aimed at neutralizing the West's moral high ground and discrediting its nuclear program. By framing the Soviet acquisition of nuclear power as a bomb for peace, Stalin sought to project an image of defensive benevolence, while simultaneously demanding an end to the American nuclear monopoly. Secondly, and perhaps most crucially, it was a cunning trap for Oppenheimer himself. Stalin, with his cold, calculating intellect, understood Oppenheimer's profound moral torment and his yearning for atonement. He knew that if he could lure Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, into collaborating on a peace bomb, it would be an unparalleled propaganda coup, a devastating blow to Western morale, and a profound symbolic victory for the Soviet Union. It would also provide invaluable insights into Western nuclear technology and Oppenheimer's unique genius. The Council of Guardians would be a mere puppet, its strings pulled from the Kremlin, its peace bomb, ultimately a tool for Soviet global dominance, enforced by the terror of a weapon Oppenheimer himself had helped perfect. Stalin's peace was simply a world ordered according to his own ruthless design, a peace achieved through absolute, unchallenged Soviet power. The realization hit Oppenheimer with the force of a physical blow. Du Bois, for all his apparent sincerity, was either a deeply naive pawn or a highly skilled agent, expertly manipulating Oppenheimer's idealism. The peace bomb was a Trojan horse, a weapon of ultimate control disguised as a beacon of hope. The choice, which had once seemed agonizingly complex, now crystallized into stark moral clarity. To participate would be to betray not just his nation, but the very principles of intellectual honesty and human freedom he held dear. It would be to lend his genius to a regime that stifled dissent, murdered millions, and sought to impose its will through brutal force. It would not be redemption, but damnation. The final meeting took place in a secluded villa on the shores of Lake Geneva, the crisp Alpine air a stark contrast to the suffocating weight of the decision Oppenheimer faced. Du Bois, sensing Oppenheimer's growing unease, made a final, impassioned plea. "Dr. Oppenheimer," he urged, his voice heavy with what seemed like genuine desperation. "The world is on the brink. Your own government has silenced you, rejected your warnings. This is your chance, perhaps the only chance, to truly shape the future, to prevent the annihilation you fear, to turn the destroyer into the ultimate protector." Oppenheimer looked at Du Bois, his gaze piercing, seeing past the facade to the larger, more sinister architecture behind the man. "Dr. Du Bois," he said, his voice low and steady, "I understand the urgency you speak of. I understand the fear, for I carry it every day. But peace enforced by the absolute terror of a single, centralized power is not peace. It is tyranny. And a bomb, by any name, remains a bomb. You ask me to build a weapon for peace, but your masters seek a weapon for control. And control, in their hands, is never benign. It is merely a prelude to domination. Du Bois's face registered a flicker of something, perhaps genuine shock, perhaps expertly feigned disappointment. "You misunderstand, Doctor," he began, but Oppenheimer cut him off. "I understand perfectly," Oppenheimer stated, rising from his chair. "I understand that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and that some intentions, however well disguised, are never good. I cannot, in good conscience, lend my hand to such a deception. My conscience may be burdened by the past, but it will not be corrupted by the future you envision." With those words, Oppenheimer turned and walked out, leaving Du Bois alone in the grand villa. He knew the decision was irreversible, and its consequences, for him personally, would be severe. He had rejected the devil's bargain, had chosen integrity over a perverted path to redemption. The immediate aftermath was swift and chillingly predictable. Oppenheimer's movements, already monitored, became even more scrutinized. The subtle overtures from Du Bois and his shadowy handlers ceased, replaced by a cold, silent watchfulness. The Soviet Union, having failed to co-opt the father of the atomic bomb, intensified its own nuclear program with renewed fury. Igor Kurchatov and his team, spurred by Stalin's relentless demands and fueled by a combination of espionage and indigenous scientific brilliance, detonated their first atomic device, First Lightning, in August 1949, far earlier than many in the West had anticipated. The shockwave of this event reverberated globally, confirming Oppenheimer's earlier warnings about the inevitability of Soviet nuclear capability and solidifying the terrifying reality of a two-sided nuclear standoff. Without Oppenheimer's direct collaboration, the "bomb for peace" rhetoric never gained significant traction as a Soviet policy initiative. Instead, it remained a dark, unfulfilled ambition of Stalin's psychological warfare, a tactic that had narrowly failed to ensnare its most coveted target. Oppenheimer, already marginalized by his own government, found his isolation deepen. The brief, secret flirtation with the Soviet proposal, though ultimately rejected, left an indelible mark. While no direct evidence of the clandestine meetings ever surfaced publicly, the heightened surveillance and the persistent, though unspoken, suspicions within American intelligence circles ensured that Oppenheimer remained a figure of distrust. His security clearance was never reinstated, and his voice, though still respected in scientific circles, held little sway in the corridors of power. He continued to advocate for international control and warn against the dangers of nuclear proliferation, but his influence was largely relegated to academic forums and public discourse, a poignant Cassandra speaking to a world increasingly deafened by the clamor of the arms race. The Cold War, unmitigated by any peace bomb, accelerated its terrifying trajectory. The development of the hydrogen bomb, which Oppenheimer had vehemently opposed, proceeded apace in both the U.S. and the Soviet Union, leading to an even more destructive escalation. The world entered an era of mutually assured destruction, a fragile peace maintained by the very terror Oppenheimer had first unleashed. His decision in Geneva, though it spared him from becoming a pawn in Stalin's game, did not alter the fundamental course of history. The genie he had released remained out of the bottle, its shadow stretching across the globe, defying the fragile balance of power for decades to come. In his later years, Oppenheimer found a measure of peace in his academic work at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. He reflected often on the choices he had made, the moral labyrinth he had navigated. He knew that his refusal to collaborate with Stalin, however obscure its details remained to the world, had preserved his integrity. He had stared into the abyss of a false peace, a peace built on deception and tyranny, and had recoiled. He had chosen the difficult path of truth and continued struggle, rather than succumbing to the seductive, yet ultimately corrupting, promise of a bomb for peace. His legacy remained complex, forever intertwined with the atomic bomb, but within that complexity lay the quiet, unyielding strength of a man who, when confronted with the ultimate moral test, chose not to become the instrument of another's destructive ambition. The chill of that autumn evening in Princeton never truly left him, but neither did the quiet conviction that he had, in his own way, fought for a truer, if more elusive, peace. The world continued to hold its breath, caught between the terrifying power he had birthed and the fragile hope for a future free from its ultimate destruction, a hope he, despite everything, never truly abandoned.